許せん。この青年にとてつもない才能と力を感じる。オープンだけ。
Hello everyone, xForts here. Welcome back to another JoJo's Bizarre Adventure discussion video. Today we have an episode of standoff between two members of the Zeppeli bloodline, William Zeppeli and his grandson Caesar Zeppeli. Neither of these characters are stand users, but rather Hamon users. So because neither of these characters possess a stand, we are going to be analyzing and comparing both William and Caesar's Ripple along with their collection of Hamon-based attacks to decide which Zeppeli is the superior Hamon warrior. This is going to be the first episode of standoff that features Hamon users, so during the analysis there's going to be a more in-depth section about each character's personality. So to start off this video, the first character we're going to be analyzing is Part 1 Phantom Blood's William Antonio Zeppeli. To start off this analysis, we're first going to be looking at appearance. William is a much taller than average man and also has a very muscular and toned build to him. This was common though for most male characters in the beginning of JoJo, because Araki was just kind of parroting off all the other series that were being serialized at the same time as JoJo. Later in the series, around part 4 and 5, his art style changed a lot and the characters became a lot thinner. So besides just being tall and muscular, he also has that Zeppeli look to him. William is always finely dressed in a nice suit and a very flamboyant top hat. Usually his clothing has some sort of checkered pattern on it. He also has dark black hair and a very finely groomed, manly handlebar mustache. As for William's personality, he is an absolute master of Hamon and has studied it for many years. He is also a very confident and very brave character, and you can see this reflected in all of his encounters. Even when it comes to Zeppeli facing sudden death, he is still as calm as ever. Zeppeli is also a very free man, and he seems to just live his life wherever it takes him. As for when he met Jonathan, he had no problems with teaching him the Ripple without ever meeting him before. And also when it came time to meet his fate, he had no problems with that and just accepted it. In just a very casual and actually pretty badass manner. And of course, William has that Zeppeli Italian spunk to him that you can see in pretty much everything he does.
Hey baby!
Moving on to William's Hamon abilities. This is going to be different from a regular episode of Standoff because of course we're looking at Hamon and not stands. And stands usually tend to have only around 1 or 2 abilities, maybe 3 or 4 at the most. But when it comes to a Hamon user, they have so many different ways that they can manipulate Hamon and make up their own attacks entirely. So that results in Hamon users having a lot of different techniques. So to start off, the first Hamon ability used by William is his Zoom Punch. The Zoom Punch of course is based around the Ripple and the breathing techniques to dislocate and stretch the joints in your arm to make your arm appear and also actually physically make it longer than it is. So you're able to hit enemies, you know, a foot or 2 outside of your range. The next ability we have is Ripple Cutter. When Zeppeli uses this technique, he actually spits out wine in between his teeth, and when he combines this with the power of Hamon, it makes the liquid extremely dense and very sharp, able to cut through solid objects, as well as it's very accurate and can deflect projectiles. Next we have Sendo Wave Kick, a pretty basic Hamon attack. He uses the Ripple infused with a strike with his knee, and the Ripple energy completely just tears through the undead and also vampires when it enters their bloodstream and just will completely melt them. The next ability we have is a little bit more memorable, the Sunlight Yellow Overdrive. Using the ability of Sunlight, Zeppeli is able to transfer the Ripple through his body into another being, causing burn damage similar to the Sendo Wave Kick. Just one simple jab is good enough to blow away an entire group of zombies and melt them to ash. Life Magnetism Overdrive is an ability used by Zeppeli and Jonathan that just gathers up all of the leaves surrounding them to create a giant leaf that they use as a hang glider, and it uses the body's natural magnetic field of conductivity to gather the leaves. Moving on to one of the last Hamon abilities we saw William use was his Tornado Overdrive. Zeppeli would leap into the air and point his legs at his opponent, and from there he would focus the Hamon on the lower half of his body, and then he would act like a drill with a spinning motion dive bomb the opponent. Finally, we have the last Hamon technique we ever saw Zeppeli use, and that is his ultimate Deep Pass Overdrive. In Zeppeli's last moments, he transferred all of his Hamon energy to Jonathan, increasing Jonathan's agility, strength, and his Ripple technique, but that caused Zeppeli's death. Because he gave Jonathan all of his life energy, it completely sucked the life out of Zeppeli, and it actually changed his appearance as well, turning all of his black hair to white, and just kind of sucking the life right out of his skin. But obviously, he made a sacrifice for a noble cause. And of Of course, William was gonna die anyways, regardless if he used D-Pass Overdrive, because he was chopped into 2 pieces. And that started the Zeppeli tradition. So for a normal episode of Standoff, once we got to the end of an analysis, we would go over the stand stats, but since we're looking at Hamon users, and Hamon never had some sort of grading system like the stands do, I decided to make my own up, and I just pretty much used the same template that the stands have, but translated it towards Hamon users. A B in destructive power, B in speed, C in range, D in durability, C in precision, and A in development potential. That's just my own personal opinion though, and I decided to throw that in there. The last thing I wanted to mention in William's analysis before we move on to Caesar is that William is a perfect example of how a character can be memorable without reoccurring. William's first appearance was in chapter 18 and his last appearance in chapter 35. That's only 17 chapters out of a series that is over 100 volumes long, and that character is still one of the most memorable of the entire series. Finally, moving on to the next analysis, we have Part 2 Battle Tendencies, Caesar Antonio Zeppeli. Again, starting off with appearance, Caesar is a young man with a very muscular built body, sporting golden blonde hair and sort of an intentional messy look. One of Caesar's more distinctive features are the colored spots on both of his cheeks. Caesar rocks his signature headband patterned with a row of triangles with mismatching colors, and he also sports 2 feathers on each side of his head. Moving on to Caesar's personality, when we first are introduced to him, he seems like a cool, calm, and collective ladies' man, sort of similar to William. But the more we find out about Caesar, we see that he's sort of a hot-blooded type character who's easy to jump into a fight regardless of the situation. And of course, Caesar takes extreme pride in the Zeppeli name and will not hesitate to charge head-on into a fight with anyone who disrespects them. And I just have to throw in that Caesar is one of my favorite supporting characters in the entire series. On to Caesar's abilities, let's start with his ripple. Caesar is actually a natural-born Hamon user, unlike his grandfather William, who actually had to learn the ripple midway through his life. Although Caesar was able to use Hamon at an early age, he wasn't able to properly use it until he had the guidance of Lisa in her training. After training with Lisa and JoJo, Caesar learned more advanced techniques like concentrating Hamon on his fingertips. Caesar's Hamon is also very different than William's. Instead of just using basic Hamon, he actually made it a little bit more personal to himself and based all of his attacks around bubbles. The first Hamon ability we're going to be looking at from Caesar is also his signature attack, and that is Bubble Launcher.
Behold, my Hamon bubble launcher!
Caesar will fire out a barrage of bubbles from his gloves, which are each coated in Hamon. This increases the power, weight, and density of the bubbles and allows it to hit objects with greater impact. This is a very powerful technique. When Joseph was hit by it, he was completely blown away. Next, we have more of a defensive type Hamon ability, and that is Bubble Barrier. Caesar will summon a single giant bubble that is capable of absorbing and trapping its target inside it. Caesar's next ability is actually based off one of William's and is Bubble Cutter, of course based off Hamon Cutter. Caesar just further reinforces his bubble launcher and creates bubbles with the ability to cut. The bubbles will spin at high speeds and are able to stay intact due to the Hamon infused with them. This will cause the bubbles to have the shape of saucers, with a small blade ranged surrounding each bubble because of the high velocity that they're moving at. And because these bubbles move a lot faster and have a higher trajectory and velocity, they allow Caesar to fire them in any direction with ease. This is one of Caesar's most powerful attacks. Next, we have a variation of the Bubble Cutter technique, which is named Bubble Cutter Gliding. This move is just a more versatile version of Bubble Cutter, so Caesar will just have to sacrifice and shoot less bubbles, but he's able to use the bubbles that he does project as sort of homing missiles that will follow around the opponent. And finally, we have Caesar's most fabulous attack, and that is Bubble Lenses. What this ability does is completely fill a room with bubble lenses, and they are able to reflect light and focus them into beams. The bubbles don't move but become stationary and sort of give the appearance of a disco room with all the flashing lights that they create. So all the bubbles will reflect light off each other, eventually homing into one single target, shooting all of the light onto it. In the case that we saw it, Caesar used this technique against Wham. I also want to mention that Bubble Lens is definitely one of the most fabulous moves in the entire series. There is actually one final technique that we saw Caesar used, but it does not have a name. Before Caesar died, he used the rest of his life energy and the rest of his Hamon to create one last bubble made out of his own blood to preserve Wham's lip ring that had the antidote in it that JoJo needed, as well as his headband, and then shouting his final words, "JoJo, this is the last of my Hamon, take it."
JoJo! 俺の最後のハモンだぜ! 受け取ってくれ!
To finish up Caesar's analysis, we have his Hamon stats. Once again, this is my grading and my opinion on what I think his stats would be. We have a B in destructive power, a C in speed, a B in range, C in durability, B in precision, and D in development potential. Before we move on to the comparison, I wanted to introduce a new segment to the standoff series. Usually the way that these standoffs go is that we introduce the two characters that we're going to be comparing, we analyze them, and then we compare them, and then we come to a conclusion on which stand or character is superior. But a subscriber by the name of Speedweed actually requested that I added in a segment that kind of shows the character's most impressive feats that they've performed with their stand. And I really like this idea, so now we're going to be adding in each character's highlights. So thank you Speedweed for requesting this, I really like the idea, and now we're going to be adding character highlights at the end of the analyses. So to start off this highlight segment, we're going to rewind to William, and we're going to go over what I personally think was his greatest moment in the series. When William Zeppeli accepted his own fate and realized that he was going to have to die battling Tarkus in order to move Jonathan's story forward, that was just such a great moment, and it showed so much about his character, and also showing a lot more techniques from William, like his tornado overdrive, as well as his deep pass overdrive, giving all of his Hamon to Jonathan, absolutely sacrificing himself for another. I thought it was just a great moment, and it showed a lot about William's character.
これが運命ならあるがまま受け入れよう。
ジェペリさん、あんた今なんて。
Moving on to Caesar's highlight, it is a little bit similar to William's considering it took place in one of his last moments. But when Caesar used his bubble lens technique and outsmarted Wham and put himself in an advantageous position against a Pillarman, really showed just how ingenious and how smart of a fighter Caesar actually was. But of course, Caesar did meet his demise to Wham, because although he was a very intelligent and very instinctual fighter, he was nothing compared to a Pillarman. Although he did put up an extremely good fight against Wham, and Wham also said himself that maybe if Kars was in the position that he was, he might have died, because the only reason Wham was able to survive is because Caesar created a shadow on him, which allowed Wham to use his wind to blow Caesar away with his divine sandstorm. It's just upsetting to know that Caesar was so close to defeating a major opponent in the series.
直接波紋を流し込んでとどめだ。一点、そして一瞬、ほんの一点の死角だった。レンズの光にシーザーの体が影となった一点。ワムーはこの一瞬を逃さなかった。
So finally, now that we've analyzed both of these characters and even shown their highlights, we can finally compare the two and decide which Zeppeli is the superior Hamon warrior. When you're comparing Hamon users, there isn't as much variety as when you're comparing stand users, considering a stand can literally be anything and do anything, especially when we're comparing two Hamon users from the same bloodline. But even though they do have some similar moves, their techniques are very different. Pretty much all of Caesar's attacks are range-based and have to do with bubbles, when more of William's attacks are close-range hand-to-hand combat moves that involve channeling Hamon through your body parts to create more of an impact. Considering most of William's main attacks that he's seen using, like Zoom Punch, Sunlight Yellow Overdrive, and Tornado Overdrive, are all hand-to-hand combat moves. William's Ripple and his Hamon abilities are a little bit less versatile than Caesar's because most of his attacks are geared towards fighting vampires and the undead, when Caesar's moves on the other hand can really damage anyone just by cutting someone or trapping them in a barrier or just launching electric bubbles at them. Most of Caesar's attacks as well are just upgraded versions of William's, like say his Bubble Cutter and his Bubble Cutter Gliding are just improved versions of William's Hamon Cutter. Caesar also has a defensive technique called Repel. Caesar was able to use his Hamon as a repellent as well as a shield. During his training, he was able to deflect a high pressure oil jet, and he did the same technique when he forced AC/DC out of Suzy Q's body. Although I'm sure that William does have a vast variety of Hamon techniques techniques that we did not see him use in the series, but that's just kind of the nature of the series. Every single part, it seems like the characters are getting stronger and stronger. I mean, just look at how powerful some of the characters have gotten if you compare Steel Ball Run to Phantom Blood. So when I look at Caesar, I see him as really just a more improved and more powerful version of William to keep the readers interested. So Araki's not just repeating the same character over again, he has to make this character unique in some way, and Araki kind of did that with Caesar's elemental type Hamon with his bubbles, but his bubbles really do a lot of the same abilities, just more versatile and more powerful than William's. It's also worth mentioning though that Caesar was in the series a lot longer than William was, and for the short amount of time that we knew William, I'm sure he only showed us a fraction of what he knew as a Hamon warrior. When on the other hand, we saw Caesar learn and grow as a Hamon user, and he actually had his own little mini training arc with another Hamon user, JoJo, and their trainer, Lisa. Caesar also had a lot more fights and a lot more opportunities to showcase his Hamon techniques than William did, considering we got to see a full-fledged fight between Caesar and a Pillar Man. And just in that fight alone, we really got to see what Caesar is capable of, when we really didn't get to see a fight like that with William. So to come to a conclusion, based on what we've seen in the story, I would have to say that Caesar is the superior Hamon user. But who knows, maybe if we got to see a little bit more of William and he got a little bit more of a dedicated fight to himself, it might be different. And that's today's episode of Standoff, or rather, Hamon Off. There will be a card in the top right corner where you guys can vote on who you thought won today's episode, as well as a playlist in the description where you guys can check out all the previous episodes of Standoff. Thank you guys so much for checking out this video. Don't forget you guys can always request any sort of what if scenarios, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure theories, or any future requests for standoffs in the comment section below. Be sure to drop a like on this video if I occupied your boredom for a little bit, or if you just enjoyed it, and also subscribe if you would like to see more JoJo content. Again, thank you guys for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed.
始まってしまった物語に奪われたままの時に今終わりを告げるため歩き続けるクルセイダー空白のラストページにその拳を叩き込め End of the world その地の記憶